So, gratitude is really one of the mindset shifts that I think can make us happier. And I think it does that through a couple different ways, right? One is that it just allows you to notice the good things you have in your life. Our mind is sort of naturally biased towards the negative in life. Social scientists call this a sort of negativity bias, but unchecked, we kind of notice all the scary stuff, all the frustrating stuff, all the kind of nasty stuff in the world. That's where our brain tends to go. Through a gratitude practice, what you do is you train your brain to do the opposite. You're intentionally focusing on some of the stuff that's a blessing in life. And research shows that that change in our framework can really just allow us to notice stuff that has been there, that's been great in our lives, that we just didn't take the chance to process or notice. So already it's kind of helping us.
Okay, I am so excited. I think if my math is correct, my third expert on happiness. This is a professor on happiness, fulfillment, contentment, well being, whatever you want to call it. She's done the homework, she's dug into the research. If you want to know what is going to make you truly happy in a long standing way, you've got to listen to this one. I learned so much when I listen to these people. I know the playbook. I don't always follow it, but it's always intriguing to hear what the science shows. This is really, really interesting. I hope you'll take the time to sit this one through. Thanks for being here. And without further ado, Yale professor Laurie Santos. Welcome to the Art of Excellence. In the words of Aristotle, excellence is never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. I am your host, Glenn Zweig. Join me now as I dive into the lives and careers of world-class entrepreneurs, athletes, entertainers, scientists, thought leaders, and explorers to uncover the ingredients to their extraordinary accomplishments. My guest today is Laurie Santos. Laurie is a professor of psychology at Yale University. In addition to her work on the evolutionary origins of human cognition, Laurie is an expert on the science of happiness and the ways in which our minds lie to us about what makes us happy. Her Yale course, Psychology and the Good Life, teaches students how the science of psychology can provide important hints about how to make wiser choices and live a life that's happier and more fulfilling. The class became Yale's most popular course in over 300 years. The online version of the class, The Science of Wellbeing, on Coursera, has attracted more than 4 million students. She was recently voted as one of Popular Science magazine's Brilliant 10 Young Minds and was named in Time magazine as a leading campus celebrity. Her podcast, The Happiness Lab, has attracted over 100 million downloads since its launch. Laurie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
I'm thrilled to have you on. Okay, I hate to do this to you, but this is where I'm going to start. We are recording this interview on November 4th, 2024. Tomorrow is the presidential election. And by the time this podcast comes out, the election, I hope, will be behind us.
We shall see. We shall see.
Depends how fast I am in the editing booth. So, first question for you, right at this moment, heading into the election, just to simplify, on a happiness scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling?
The happiness scale of 1 to 10. I mean, I'm always like a reasonably happy person. I feel like I'm like kind of a 6 these days. The phrase I like to use is that I'm nauseously optimistic about how the election's going to go.
Nauseously optimistic. That's interesting. I like that. I like that. So I guess here's where I'm going with the question. And it's for you, but it's also through you to me and to everyone else listening, which is, as a happiness guru, if I can call you that, do you find that you're able to somehow modulate your emotions in the moment when you're feeling a lot of stress and anxiety, like say right about now?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth recognizing like kind of how emotions work, right? I
Mm.
think when we face a stimulus in the world that's like scary or anxiety provoking or frustrating, we're going to have that initial reaction, right? Like we're going to kind of experience that emotion when we're faced with a particular trigger. But the question is, what do you do after that, right? Do you then doom scroll for the next 2 hours on Twitter? Do you take a break and go for a walk and look at the beautiful, autumn weather? Like there are kind of different ways we can react to that initial moment of emotion. And
Mm.
I think that's the part that I've started to do a little bit differently. Not always, right? I'm not 100% on doing this. And I think that's important too, right? We're all human and we need to give ourselves a little self compassion to come to this. But I think what I'm doing differently now is kind of how I react to those emotions. I'm just as scared and anxious and frustrated and nauseously optimistic as maybe everybody who's listening, or at least as they were listening before this episode came out. But I think I handle that a little bit differently. I'm kind of aware of how my self talk affects things, and I try to engage in strategies that are maybe healthier than I used to.
Well, I think while you're nauseously optimistic, I might be excitedly pessimistic. Maybe two sides of the same coin. Uh, your course that you teach, this happiness course, it's called Psychology and the Good Life. It is the most popular Yale course in history. What was the genesis of the course? It obviously struck a chord.
Yeah, so the course really started, when I took on a new role at Yale. I became what's known as a head of college. So
Hmm.
I've been faculty at Yale, for over 20 years. I've been teaching there for a long time. But in the last 5 years or so, I took on this new role where I became a head of college. And this is a faculty member who lives on campus with students. I was hanging out with them in the dining hall and seeing them in the coffee shop. And honestly, I didn't like what I was seeing. I was seeing this so-called student mental health crisis up close and personal, where
Hmm.
right now nationally more than 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most days. Around two-thirds report feeling overwhelmingly anxious and very lonely. More than 1 in 10 students nationally has considered suicide in the last 6 months. Like the kind of situation I was seeing on campus wasn't like a few snowflakes as we often hear about it in the news. It was really a full-blown mental health crisis. And so as a faculty member who cared about students and a psychologist who knew a little bit about the science of well-being, I thought, well, we got to do something to help these students, right? I don't think we're achieving our educational mission in college unless we're really addressing this crisis. And so I said, well, what can I do? I'm not a clinical psychologist. I can't give students therapy, but I can train students in what the science shows you can do to feel better when things are
Mm.
feeling stressful. And so I said, well, let me make this new class. I'll kind of fill it with all these sort of evidence-based strategies that are really practical, right, that students could use. And I christened the class Psychology and the Good Life, so it sounded kind of cool and it sort of popped out of the course catalog. But I still thought, as a new class on campus, I expected, 30 or 40 students to take it. I was surprised when our initial enrollment numbers went over 1,000, which is an unprecedented number for students. It was basically a quarter of the entire Yale student body and tried to enroll in the class the first time we taught it. And that was humbling. I think it taught me something interesting. It taught me that students are voting with their feet. They don't like this culture of feeling stressed out and anxious. And I think they really were craving some evidence-based strategies they could use to do better.
What was the year that you started this?
So this was like 2018 when frankly I think it was maybe prescient to be talking about mental health, right? We didn't know when I first taught this class in 2018 that the COVID-19 crisis was just around the corner. A lot of those numbers that I quoted have only gotten worse since I've taught the class.
They've gotten worse. And what I'm wondering is, forget the pandemic for a moment, back in 2018, were these stats on anxiety and depression, were those gradually increasing over time? Was there some sort of accelerant before you got there?
They've been increasing over time since we've been able to measure. And
Mm.
the tipping point really seems to be around like 2005, 2007. Scholars like Jonathan Haidt have really pointed to, the fact that we have moved much more online, things like social media and cell phones and so on.
Hmm.
I think at the same time, there's a lot more academic pressures that students are facing, not just at an Ivy League place like Yale, but kind of all over. I think there's a whole host of reasons. It'd be easy if there was like one red herring that was causing the problem because we could just get rid of that and be fine. I think it was a number of things, but the stats have been, those terrible stats and those numbers have been going up drastically. Like that statistic of, how many students are depressed, that number has doubled since 2010.
Mm.
And I'm about your age. It feels like 2010 was like a nanosecond ago. Like, the songs that were like
Yeah.
came out in 2010. I'm like, oh, this is this cool recent song. It's like that wasn't that long for the rates to really double. And
Wow.
so, yeah.
One of the, I think it might have been the first person I interviewed on the podcast, and it was before you started. It was 2017. He was, I don't know if maybe he still is, a professor at University of Texas. He taught this course on happiness. His name is Raj Raghunathan, if that rings a bell, or if you ever came across his work. I think he wrote a book like "If You're So Successful, Why Are You Unhappy?" or something to that effect. But your class has exploded, and beyond your class, you've got 100 million downloads and counting in your podcast. You've gotten millions, 4 million, 5 million taking your Coursera class. So you're not the only person doing happiness, right? Teaching happiness, educating on happiness, well-being, whatever you want to call it. And we'll get to that. Actually, I want to unpack the word. Why do you suppose you've had so much success teaching this?
Yeah, well, I think, the Yale class obviously, was when this sort of started for me. And I think it's in part because Yale, for better or for worse, gets a lot of press attention, maybe more press attention than many of my colleagues at other schools who are also teaching happiness classes. And I think that's really important. I'm glad you brought it up. I think sometimes folks think like, oh, you were the first person to teach a class like this. I'm like, no, there were positive psychology classes all over the country. They just kind of weren't at Yale, and the students really sort of flocked to it. So I think part of it is being at a place that's the kind of place that will get press attention and so on. But I think another reason that we've had so much success with the class, both at Yale and beyond, is just the fact that we really take this sort of evidence-based approach to the question, right? We're really kind of asking like, well, what does the science say about improving flourishing? And I think that can be a difference. A lot of the other classes I've seen kind of focus on like different ways of kind of getting at the problem, maybe looking to the ancients, looking to ancient wisdom and these kinds of things. And there definitely is a place for that kind of approach. But I do think the students of today are kind of like, what does the science say? Show me the studies, like show me this sort of evidence-based approach. And that was one of the reasons they resonated. I think another thing that makes the class different is sort of the approach I take, which is this idea that our minds really lie to us when it comes to happiness. It's not that we don't have intuitions about the kinds of things that will make us happy. We have tons of intuitions. I would say that all those students who are self-reporting feeling depressed and anxious, even experiencing suicidality, they're trying to improve their happiness, right? They're engaging in goals and values that they think are going to feel like make them feel better, make them feel like they're flourishing, but they're doing it wrong. And I think this gets to one of the reasons that the class has been so impactful. It's sort of allowing students to overcome their biases and think a little bit differently.
So these may be very related here, but I'm trying to separate how to remove anxiety and depression and the negative to what it seems our society is fixated with, which is finding some sort of happiness elixir, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one of the things I often talk to the students about is that the strategies that you need to feel better kind of depend on where you are at baseline. The analogy I like to use is with your physical health, right? If you walked into your doctor and you're like, hey, doctor, I'm experiencing high blood pressure, you look at your labs and they don't look good, your doctor would say, hey, well, maybe you need to eat a little healthier, hop on the treadmill every once in a while. If you walk into your doctor's office, clutching your chest and saying, I'm in acute cardiac arrest right at this moment, your doctor's not gonna be like, well, eat healthy. Like there's a different remedy you need when you're in an extremely bad place, right?
Yeah.
I think the same is true with mental health, right? If a student, comes into my office who's experiencing a panic attack or acute suicidality, the remedy is not going to be, well, hey, take my course and learn these strategies. We're going to want to intervene in a different way, right? They need kind of clinical help. Whereas for students who are kind of just feeling a little empty, not feeling like they're flourishing. Maybe they don't meet the clinical definition of depression and anxiety, but they really want to develop strategies to do better to maybe prevent that when stressors come up in the future. That's the kind of thing that I'm teaching in the course. And so I think that on the one hand, we need to sort of pay attention to kind of where we are at baseline. The hope is that we can kind of go above the neutral line and sort of experience happiness and flourishing and so on. But if you're way below kind of baseline, if you're way below neutral and you need some strategies, those might look different. However, I think once you kind of get through that clinical phase, same thing with the physical health description. Once you get through the acute heart attack and everything's okay and you go back to your doctor's going to say the same thing. Okay, now you need to watch what you're eating and hop on the treadmill, right? You go back to those sort of preventative measures. And that's how I think about the strategies I talk about in the class. They're really preventative measures. So hopefully we don't get to the point where we're really struggling in terms of our mental health.
Yeah, so maybe just to help with the definition, if we could. And I'm trying to separate happiness from words like contentment or fulfillment or well-being. So because you have to start with what you're trying to get to know what to measure and know that you're successful in helping someone get to a different state. Can you help me maybe with a definition of happiness or well-being or whatever word you feel best describes what you're trying to teach?
Yeah, I often use happiness, which is different than a lot of my academic colleagues who use well-being, but by well-being, they just mean happiness. And so it's sort of I think it's like a way like, well, that word happiness is sort of fraught. So we'll pick a different one, but we actually mean the same thing. So it's a little complicated, but the way I think about happiness tends to be the way that social scientists define this term subjective well-being. And by that, they mean two things. They mean the sense of being happy in your life and the sense of being happy with your life. So the sense of being happy in your life is that you're experiencing a decent ratio of positive to negative emotions. It feels good to kind of be in your life. Importantly, that doesn't mean no negative emotions. And I imagine we'll kind of talk about this for a true flourishing life. I think we want some negative emotions to kind of keep us on track. But hopefully the ratio is pretty good. So you have states like contentment and joy and laughter that exist alongside states like sadness, anxiety, and so on, right? That's kind of being happy in your life. But there's a sort of second component that I think can be defined as being happy with your life. And that's how you think your life is going. It's how satisfied you are with your life. It's the answer to the question, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life? And this embodies what researchers talk about as the affective and cognitive components of well-being. You kind of emotionally feel like your life is going, it feels nice to be in your life, and you think your life is going well. And a lot of the remedies I talk about in class are trying to maximize both of those. It's worth noting that those can dissociate, right? I was just interacting with my colleague who's a professor at Harvard, who he and his wife have just had a newborn baby. And I think that's a moment where in their life, there's, dirty diapers and nobody's sleeping and there's colic, right? But with their life, oh my gosh, this wonderful sense of meaning and this, important thing that they've done. So that's a moment where you can kind of have this dissociation where in your life, there's some kind of frustrations and maybe it's not feeling good, but with your life, you feel this wonderful impact. And I think we all know people who experience the opposite. You mentioned sort of, I'm so successful, why don't I feel happy, right? We all see these people who have every hedonic pleasure in life. They can fly first class and eat the best meals and drink the best wine, but they sort of feel empty. They don't necessarily think their life is going well. And so my best case scenario is that we're maximizing both of those. And there are sets of strategies we can use to do that.
Do you know by any chance, another person I had in the podcast a while back, Bob Waldinger? Gina Bob.
Yeah.
He wrote, for those that haven't heard the episode, I mean, he is the current head of the longest study, I think ever, the longest longitudinal study on if happiness, once again, is the right word or not, but just tracking a cohort of people over and their kids and their kids' kids over decades and trying to understand ultimately by the time you get to your deathbed what really mattered the most. Very interesting because I mean, there were a number of factors, but I think head and shoulders above all others was this idea of connection, of relationships. And I think you've preached the same thing, that this is probably the one thing that trumps everything else.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you had to put your money on one thing you could do to feel happier, I think investing in your social relationships is a big one. One of the most famous positive psychology papers was one by the psychologists Marty Seligman and Ed Diener, two big kind of, huge figures in the field of positive psychology. And the name of the paper is called Very Happy People. And so they
Mm.
went through and they said, all right, we're going to pick out the people who self-report being very happy, like the, extremes in the distribution of happy people. And we're going to ask, what do they do differently? And there are only two things that sort of popped out that if you look at people's time logs, the very happy people were doing differently. They prioritized time with their friends and family members, right? They were just spending time with the people they cared about, and they were just physically around people more often, right? They just
Mm.
spent more time around people. And I think that's really telling. I think that that study really shows us that investing in our social relationships matters much more than we think. And this is a spot where I think our mistaken ideas about happiness bring us wrong, right? We think like, well, happiness is about money or it's about getting accolades at work or, for my students, it's about performing and doing really great, my midterm or whatever. And often we're investing in those things at the expense of our social relationships. This is a beautiful thing on Bob's work because he can follow people through their deathbed and he hears time and again people saying like, I wish I'd spent more time with my family or my grandkids than on my job. Why did I waste time in the office when I could have been with the people I cared about? And I think that message really resonates with what the data are showing, which is that social connection is the one big predictor of whether you feel happy in your life and you feel good with your life.
So can I geek out just for a second
Please,
on,
yeah.
on stats? So how do you separate whether the social connections make one happy or happy people just generally tend to be more social, if that makes sense? Like what's the
Totally, yeah.
correlation versus a causation here?
And this is something I get from my students all the time. They're like, like they pick up on that kind of correlation does
Hmm.
not equal causation. And they say something else. They often say, well, I'm miserable and I don't feel like hanging out with anybody, right? So it's definitely goes in the causal direction. Yeah. So what you need there is an experiment, right? We need to force people to be more social and ask, does that actually improve their well-being? And this is the kind of thing that researchers have done, both in like a deep scale of like kind of changing the overall amount of time you're spending with friends and family members, and in just a simple way where you just get people to talk to strangers and try to make a meaningful connection with, say, a barista at the coffee shop or the person they meet on the
Hmm.
train on their commute to work. And one of my favorite versions of this study comes from Nick Epley, who did the commute to work version of this. He's based at the University of Chicago, and he gets commuters who are going from the suburbs into work in Chicago and offers them a $10 Starbucks gift card to be in a study. And everybody says yes because
Hmm.
$10 Starbucks gift cards are the engine of all social science research, apparently. But he puts people in one of two conditions. Either he tells people, all right, for the rest of the train ride, I want you to really try to enjoy your solitude, right? Don't talk to anybody, but really try to, enjoy what you can being by yourself. Or he says, for the rest of the train ride, I want you to talk to a complete stranger and don't just talk about the weather, really try to make a deep and meaningful connection with them. He has a different group of subjects predict how this is going to feel. And subjects, by and large, predict that the kind of social connection condition, that condition where you have to talk to a complete stranger, is going to
Hmm.
feel miserable. It's going to be awkward. It's not even just going to be at baseline. It's going to take you below baseline. But when people actually do this, he finds something really striking, which is that no matter what your personality type, introvert or extrovert, that social connection condition feels good. And it feels better than baseline and also better than you feel in the solitude condition. And this study I love because it tells us a couple things. One is it tells us that like it really isn't just kind of a correlation. It's causal, right? If you don't feel like it and you force yourself to be more social, you'll actually experience more positive emotion by the end of the day doing that. But also it tells us that our intuitions are wrong, right? People are walking around with the hypothesis like, oh, I don't want to talk to somebody on the train. That's going to be weird. It's going to be weird for me, weird for them. It's just going to suck. But then when you do it, you wind up feeling happier. And so
Hmm.
I think it tells us something really important, that one of the reasons we don't go for social connection and try to invest in it is we just like don't realize how important it is.
I wonder if those people on the train that grabbed the Starbucks gift certificate ended up continuing that habit, on their train rides.
Well, I wonder. I mean, I can only speak for myself, right? Having read these studies, I'm not naturally a very social person, especially with strangers. I feel like
Hmm.
I'm from the Northeast, and I feel like folks in the Northeast, it's a different kind of like social climate of just kind of culture of talking to people randomly on the street and stuff. But even though I have that intuition, I've tried this more, like I sit on the plane, I'm like, okay, and steel myself up, think of the paper and like start the conversation. And it's true, whenever I've done that, whenever I've kind of not listened to my intuition, but really listened to what the data are suggesting, I wind up feeling better. Uber rides where I kind of chat with the driver go by way faster than the ones where I'm kind of scrolling through my phone and feeling a little antisocial, right? And so I don't know about the people in Nick's study, but I know for myself, hearing this work, it's caused me to think like, okay, I should try this. And when you try it, it gets easier to do it.
Well, I'm actually flying this afternoon to Washington, D.C., where I'll be tomorrow on Election Day. So I'll see if I talk up with some stranger sitting next to me, if that helps offset the stress and anxiety I'm feeling about the election coming up. We'll see which one weighs more. You mentioned earlier, you alluded to like your one's basis or something like that. And I was thinking that I imagine everyone has a different, I don't know, there's probably a technical term for this, but like a natural default emotional setting. I don't know if that's homeostasis or an equilibrium point. Some people are just naturally glass half full kind of people, and some people are glass half empty, just by design, without any external triggers at all. So first, I guess, is there any truth to that? And if the answer is yes, are we actually able to rewire ourselves so we can view things, view the world, view our situation through a different lens?
Yeah, so there are studies that are kind of looking at that sort of happiness baseline, as people tend to refer to it. Often those studies try to look genetically, using the kind of standard technique that people use when they're looking for, the basis of something, which are what's called twin studies. And so the idea is if happiness tends to kind of be a little bit built in, then identical twins, no matter their circumstances, should be more similar in their happiness than, say, fraternal twins who are less not perfectly genetically related. And tons of studies on that. And it finds that seems like well-being is sort of heritable. Its heritability estimate looks maybe more like weight than height. So in other words, like height is, genetically heritable, but there's not that much. I mean, I guess you could eat differently or something, but we know weight, for example, is like, there's lots of stuff you can do to kind of change it around. It looks a little bit like that, right? And what that means is that, there's probably some predisposition. You have, just like you're predisposed to kind of, I'm on the heavier side, it's like my genetics, I'm come from a long line of people who tended to be overweight. I have to pay a little bit more attention than somebody who might have come from a long line of people who are naturally skinny, naturally athletic, and so on. And I think the intuition is that happiness kind of works the same way, right? But like, people who are kind of predisposed to not be so happy might need to work in a different way. But the question is like, is that, is your heritability destiny, right? And folks like Sonia Lyubomirsky and her colleagues have really looked at this. And what she's argued is that it's really not. Like there's a lot of our happiness that seems to be move aroundable. In various of her kind of early papers, she sort of estimated that being around like 40% of your happiness is sort of like flexible based on your situation and so on. I don't know if there's a perfect, I think people have debated what that particular number, but the upshot is that there's a lot you can do to kind of move it around, which is exciting news. And the other part of the news is that Sonia Lyubomirsky and her colleagues have also tried to estimate, well, how much of that is your circumstances? Because you might think, well, part of it, your kind of destiny of whether you're going to be happy is in your genes. Part of it's like, did you wind up privileged? Did you grow up in like some yucky environment? And her estimate is that much less of it than we think is really due to our circumstances. It's really a lot due to our behavior and our mindset. And that's also good news because honestly, just like it's hard to control our genes, it's also pretty hard to control our circumstances. We can move it around a little bit through our actions, but some people are just luckier in terms of like what they roll into in their lives than others. And so it's really good news that a lot of our happiness is sort of much more under our conscious control than we often assume.
Interesting. It's encouraging. I wonder if they've done work in terms of, well, so it's maybe a crude analogy, but if you take the weight loss, I don't know what the percentage is, so I won't throw it out, but a pretty significant percentage of those that lose weight over time put it right back on.
Yep.
So I wonder with the happiness, whether these changes in our feelings and our emotional state, whether it's typically sustainable or whether we bounce back over time. But it's super encouraging though to hear that.
Yeah, to my knowledge, no one studied that particular statistic, at least not in the kind of careful way they've done for weight loss. But I think the analogy holds, right? Like what we need to do to be happier is to change our behavior and our mindset, often doing so in a way that violates our intuition, right? Take me on the plane where I'm like sitting near this person. I know all the research on social connection, but I have to engage in a behavior that doesn't necessarily come intuitively for me. I'm like, all right, I got to talk to this person. And sometimes I'm good at that and it works and I, improve my well-being. And sometimes I just ignore it. It's just a pain and I don't feel like doing it, right? It's very similar to the kind of weight loss analogy. Some mornings I'm getting up and hitting the gym, and some mornings it's dark and there's an election coming up, and I'm like, oh, I don't even feel like dealing with this morning, right?
Yeah.
But those things matter. And so, Sonia Lyubomirsky has this lovely quote in her book, her famous book about how to be happier, which is, kind of you can become happy, but it takes constant work and effort, just like all good things in life.
Yeah.
Raising a kid, making your body healthier, learning an instrument, right? You just have to kind of keep practicing daily. And I think many of the happiness strategies we talk about work like that. Most don't you can develop habits so that it gets easier, but it still takes work and effort, like many good things in life.
Yeah, there's no pill, unfortunately. I'm waiting for the pill.
Yeah, the happiness Ozempic. It's going to come. Yeah, we'll see.
So in back to the tools that one does have at their disposal, we talked about social connections. You've mentioned getting sufficient sleep. I'm still working on that, not too successfully. The right diet. Two that I found really interesting were practicing gratitude and helping others. So I want to talk about the gratitude first. And I wasn't sure if this is like keeping a gratitude journal or if this is about calling someone up that you care about and expressing your appreciation of them, or maybe a combination, but love to have you unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so gratitude is really one of the mindset shifts that I think can make us happier. And I think it does that through a couple different ways, right? One is that it just allows you to notice the good things you have in your life. Our mind is sort of naturally biased towards the negative in life. It's social scientists call this a sort of negativity bias, but unchecked, we kind of notice all the scary stuff, all the frustrating stuff, all the kind of nasty stuff in the world. That's where our brain tends to go. Through a gratitude practice, what you do is you train your brain to do the opposite. You're intentionally focusing on some of the stuff that's a blessing in life. And research shows that change in our framework can really just allow us to notice stuff that has been there, that's been great in our lives, that we just didn't take the chance to process or notice. So already it's kind of helping us. But there's also a factor of gratitude that kind of winds up increasing our social connection. Because if you think of a lot of the things that you're grateful for in life, usually they're not things. Usually they're people. Or even if it's things in life, it's like something that someone gave to you or helped you with and so on. And so gratitude also winds up helping us because it winds up making us feel a little bit more connected, a little bit more sort of part of the social fabric of life. So in terms of how to experience it more, I think whatever you can do to feel that feeling, to notice the good stuff is great. Lots of evidence that things like a gratitude journal seems to help, especially if you sort of do it regularly. But if you wind up finding ways to express your gratitude, that can actually make you feel even happier. If only through the way of like when you express gratitude to people, you have to talk to them and make a social connection. So it's kind of just relying on this other factor we know can sort of boost our happiness so much. And study after study really shows that we don't express gratitude as much as we should. We sort of think that people know we're grateful for them, but people genuinely don't know that we think they're a blessing until we tell them. So the act of telling people is another one of these domains where we kind of get it wrong. It's like, take my husband, Mark, I love him so much. I think he assumes that I love him, that I'm really grateful for him. But when you say it, all of a sudden things change, right? Now he really knows. And so you can get specific about the specific things that he did. He's feeling great. I'm experiencing the gratitude. I'm feeling great. Just that act of expressing can be so powerful. One of the biggest, longest standing happiness interventions I know of is what's called a gratitude letter, where you really write a letter of gratitude to someone who's helped you or been really kind to you, but you never thank that person. And research by Marty Seligman and his colleagues finds that you not only get a significant boost in people's happiness and overall kind of joy when they do this, but that boost can last up to beyond a month, like somewhere between 1 to 3 months is how long he sees those effects lasting, which feel incredible. But that's sort of the power of sort of changing your mindset and connecting with people and thanking them.
If my gratitude letter to my wife happens on her birthday, on our anniversary, and on Valentine's Day, is that enough, or that doesn't count?
I think those count, right? She'll feel differently after reading that letter, but I think the spontaneous ones are useful. I think one of the things in the original gratitude intervention design was kind of not on a birthday, not on an anniversary, just like a surprise, and maybe even to someone that you haven't even seen in a while. It's one thing to do it with your wife; it's another to do it with, I don't know, your high school gym teacher, or somebody from that last organization you worked at that you really just kind of think fondly back to, your college roommate who you haven't talked to in a long time, right? Those moments where we connect with somebody we haven't been as closely connected with in a while, and we express something so vulnerable that matters so much to them, it can make us feel really good. And the thing is, we know that when we're on the other side of it. I don't know, Glenn, if you've ever gotten like a thank you card from someone. As faculty, we get this as professors, we get this from students on occasion, where students will write us like a genuinely appreciative email or send us a little note. And like, I don't know about you, but those things exist. Like I have like a special like folder in my inbox where I keep those kinds of emails, or if you get like a card, you kept it, like it's in, and so I think that's the thing we know, that when we experience something like that, when someone thanks us, it feels so good, but we forget that we can give that good feeling to other people.
Yeah. We're actually right now in the process of doing I'm an executive search consultant and leadership advisor during the day. We've got our annual review process. We call it a dozen references, but half of those you do yourself. So you're calling the referee and asking, okay, what was your experience working with me, and gave me the honest feedback and everything. And you hear some very flattering things that you would have never heard otherwise. And first to admit it, it feels really good. It feels nice to be appreciated. The other one is this idea of helping others, and I find it really interesting that happy people aren't super self-focused, if you will. Mm-hmm. That they're more focused on others. They donate more. They volunteer more. They give to charity more. And it's interesting that you're trying to make other people happy, but that actually ends up making you more happy. And there's the irony in the whole thing, which is giving others pleasure increases your own pleasure, which is, it sort of makes sense, maybe counterintuitive, but you found that to be a pretty big predictor.
Yeah, and I think, this is something that really violates, I think, the cultural wisdom right now. And if you look, especially the kind of things my college students look at on TikTok and things, it's all about self-care or treat yourself, it seems to be really focused on doing stuff for yourself. Whereas, as you mentioned, all the studies show that it's really about other people. And, you noted, like, it's not that shocking. I mean, if I tell you, hey, doing nice stuff for other people feels good, you're like, great, but these things that feel like kind of grandmotherly wisdom are often not like common practice. It's common wisdom, but not common practice. And this is a spot where I think the science can really help, right? Just as we might worry about that correlation, right? People who do lots of nice stuff for other people are happier. Was that because they're happier, so they do more nice stuff for other people? Or is it the reverse? And I think this is a case where both of the effects are there. There definitely is a phenomena that social scientists have studied called the feel good, do good effect, which is that if you're in a good mood, you do nicer stuff for other people, you're more likely to volunteer and so on. But there's also intervention studies where you force people to do nice stuff for others and find that they wind up happier as a result. One of my favorite studies comes from the labs of Lara Ackman and Liz Dunn. They do this study that's very fun for college students. They don't use the $10 Starbucks gift card, but they just hand people $20 on the street. And they're like, hey, do you want to be in a study? Here's $20. So subjects, especially college students, are like, oh my gosh, this is great, right? But the key is that they tell students how to spend that money. They either say, by the end of the day, do something nice for yourself with this $20, go out and treat yourself. Or by the end of the day, use this $20 to do something nice for somebody else. It could be your roommate, it could be, an unhoused person that you see on the street. Like, just, it has to be about somebody else. And what they find is that by the end of the day, and even at the end of the week, people self-report being happier when they spend the money on other people. This is another spot, though, where people mispredict, right? They have another group of subjects answer, hey, say I gave you this $20, which would make you happier, treating yourself or doing something nice for other people? And subjects, by and large, say like, oh, treating myself, obviously it would make me happier, right? Spending the money on myself. And I think this is something that, like, again, we can forget in the trenches. Like, if I'm having a bad day, my instinct usually isn't, let me check on a friend or let me donate $20 to a good cause and help someone in need. It's usually like, let me gift my coworker a manicure. No, it's like, I'm going to get a manicure myself. I'm going to buy myself the nice latte. Like, and I think we're missing out. We're spending money to improve our mood. But if we spent it slightly differently, if we spent it in a way that was a little bit more other oriented, we'd wind up feeling happier. That's what the data show.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because my sense is, the data is pretty strikingly obvious in terms of what to do. I mean, if you take your course, if you read your interviews, I mean, here's your list of things, your top 5 list, et cetera. But most people still don't do it, by and large. And I've heard you say one of your interviews that even you yourself, how watching Netflix with a glass of wine might be what you tend to do after a long, hard, stressful day, instead of calling a friend and expressing gratitude or writing in a journal or something like that. So, and I take it, it's just because it's a nice dopamine hit to do the glass of wine, the Netflix, something that is quick and immediately, jolts your emotional state. And the others maybe affect the well-being over a period of time, but maybe not instantaneously. Is that fair?
Maybe. I mean, I think, calling that, so let's take the Netflix and wine example, right?
Yeah.
I think I plop down and have Netflix and wine. It feels fine. Really, probably though, ultimately it feels a little apathetic. I feel a little gross. I'm like checking my phone while I do it, right? I'm predicting that it's going to feel good, but in fact, it probably doesn't feel as good as my prediction. Let's contrast that with, I have a bad day. I call my college roommate, right? Like, there's a little friction. I have to get up the energy. I have to call her. The first step isn't as good as popping the cork and, taking the sip. But probably immediately after that, I'm going to feel much more fulfilled. It's not like long-term, eventually 20 years down the line, I'm happy I called the friend. I'm usually immediately, once I get into it, happier I called the friend. Let's take another example, right? Like, another thing I tend not to do when I'm having a hard day, but I know would make me feel better, is to just engage in a hard workout, right? Like, what I need then is a really hard yoga session, right? The first couple moments of putting on my, yoga pants and rolling the mat, starting, I'm like, ugh. But 3 minutes into that, I'm like, oh my gosh, my body feels so open. I'm so much more energized, right? And so I think it's not just this issue of the immediate dopamine hit versus kind of what we get out of it long term. Maybe really locally in the first couple minutes of doing that activity, or the first couple moments, there is some friction often for the ones that work. But really, as soon as you get into it, you wind up getting more of a benefit immediately. I think the problem is that we just have messed up theories about what's going to feel good. And this is another spot where I use the analogy of kind of eating and weight, again, maybe because I'm the kind of person who struggles with weight and something like this. If I'm having a bad day, I feel like, oh, I'm going to get a cupcake and I'm going to feel so much better. But no, I'll feel kind of gross immediately afterwards. It's not just the long-term consequences for my health. It's really it doesn't feel as good as I think, but I have this kind of messed up theory. And this is something that psychologists have studied for a long time. In fact, not just psychologists, but neuroscientists. There seems to be this interesting disconnect between the things that we want, the things that we have craving for, that we go after, and the things that we like, the things that we really enjoy. Neuroscientists see this most with drugs of addiction, right? Where, you take an active heroin addict, they have incredible craving for the drug, they do terrible things to get the drug, but when they get it, they don't really even enjoy it, right? It's almost like at baseline, right? They're habituated to it. So they're not getting the liking hit, at least not that they got when the first time they took the drug, right? And I think there's so many things like that in mini versions in our own lives where we don't actually get that much of a dopamine hit in terms of the liking, but we get a strong dopamine hit in terms of the craving. Take something that's salient for us having this conversation today, doom scrolling, right? Like, I kind of know rationally that I'm going to feel crappy if I like scroll through Reddit for 20 minutes and click on everything that's about the election. I'm going to feel yucky. But like, I have a strong craving to do that, a much stronger craving than I at least personally have to like, throw on my gym shorts and, hit the treadmill. Like, it just feels good. It just kind of have this craving, and I assume it's going to feel good sort of when I kind of rationally know it will sort of feel yucky. And I think that's what we're pushing against with a lot of the happiness stuff. These quick hits, the Netflix with wine, the doom scrolling, we get strong craving for that stuff, whereas we don't get strong craving for writing in our gratitude journal or scribbling and these things. And that's annoying because if the mind was set up to get us to experience pleasure, everything would be much easier. But unfortunately, that is not the way we got designed.
It's almost like you have to somehow habitualize. You have to make these things a habit and do it regularly. And the less frequently you do it, probably the harder it is, just because inertia is such a powerful force. I mean, I get up at 4:30 in the morning every day to work out, and I do it because if I don't do it first thing in the morning, I know I'll have plenty of excuses of why I can't do it later. I'm too tired, or there's too much work, there's too much going on. There's a Netflix show I got to binge. So it's more about how do you just make it something that's a regular part of one's routine.
And that's one of the things we've really built into the course. Students have their normal, midterm and final exam, but we also have practices that I call rewirements. They're like course requirements. They're like rewirements. And the idea is to rewire students' habits. But when students practice these behaviors in the context of the course, the hope is that they get some experience with it. They can see the benefits of it. They sort of do the experiment on themselves to see what works and what doesn't work. But more, they build it into a habit that, they've done for, the 4 months or so that they're taking the course. Hopefully it will stick around after that.
Well, just to rewind a little bit, before you began studying happiness, and I think this might be going all the way back to your undergrad studies, you were studying primate behavior. And your living laboratory, if you will, was this small island, and I'm going to butcher it, but is it Cayo Santiago?
Cayo Santiago.
Cayo Santiago off the coast of Puerto Rico, with roughly, I think I read 1,000 rhesus monkeys roaming about. Why monkeys? What drew you to that?
Yeah, well, kind of before I was, a happiness guru, as you kindly put it, I was a psychologist who studied the origins of human cognition. So I was really interested in this question of what makes humans special, both when it comes to the really smart and interesting things we do, but also when it comes to the kind of not so smart things that humans do. And the way to study what makes humans special is to actually turn to non-human animals, right? To ask the question, do our closest living relatives have something like the kind of thing that we do? And so studying the monkeys on Cayo Santiago was great because they're a kind of group of naturally living monkeys that free range around this island in Puerto Rico. And we can sort of study them in their naturalistic setting because these monkeys are really habituated to humans. So we could kind of go down there with teams of students, present them studies, a lot like the studies that are done with human babies, which is another population that can't talk. So you have to ask how they make choices and what they look at and so on. But we sort of set up those studies to test how the monkeys made sense of the world. And folks often ask like, well, how is this connected to the whole happiness stuff? And I think it's connected sort of in two ways, right? One is when I think about why we're not as happy as we could be, I think a lot of it are these sort of built-in strategies that kind of lead us along the wrong path, right? Things like a negativity bias, things like the fact that we kind of don't have wanting and liking systems that are linked up. And a lot of those things I think are kind of built-in strategies that we're doing badly. In some ways, we're fighting against our natural tendencies. And those are natural tendencies that I might expect to see in monkeys and so on. So I think it was my background doing comparative cognition that allows me to think of happiness in the way I do, is like these set of strategies that are kind of built in that are leading us astray. But another reason that it's kind of been interesting to transition from monkeys to the happiness work is that even though I've sort of switched gears and I don't spend as much time doing comparative cognition work, studying the monkeys was one of the spots where I personally was like most happy. Like you're out in the world and kind of this beautiful island, chasing after these monkeys. You just get a lot of flow, kind of problem solving, because designing studies to work with monkeys that are free ranging is not the easiest thing on the planet. So there's a lot of like flow and problem solving. And I just really enjoyed watching the monkeys. In some ways, I think they're a really good example of how we should be spending our lives if we want to be more mindful and in the present moment. I have a tendency never to be a human being. I'm always a human doing, but the monkeys are just human beings. Like, I mean, they're not human, they're monkey beings. I guess they're just in the present moment watching things. It's ironic because if you talk to meditation teachers, they'll often refer to the monkey mind, by which they mean, the mind that kind of goes all over the place when you try to sit and meditate. And I've always thought that was an unnecessarily unfair insult to monkeys, because I'm like, if you watch their mind, it's not jumping around. It's whatever, if they're eating, their mind is like eating. If they're grooming someone, their mind is like grooming someone. If they're just sitting there, their mind is
they're
like,
in the moment.
They're in the moment.
That's interesting. Well, I know a lot of your work was around economic decision making, the monkeys, but back to attempting to link this with happiness. Are you able to in any way observe like an emotional state a monkey has that might somehow proxy our version of what we call happiness?
Yeah, well, this gets to a question I'm often asked about human happiness, which is how do we measure it? And, just like we don't have a pill that makes us happier, we don't have a good instrument to measure happiness. We don't have a great happiness thermometer that I could stick in your mouth and it says, 98.6 happy or something. What we have to do is we have to ask people. Which when I first started this work was kind of frustrating. I was like, we just ask people? Like, that seems like not the most scientific method. But your decades of research show that your self-report of, say, for example, how many positive emotions did you experience last week? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life? It correlates with things like, machine learning analysis of your social media posts or detailed interviews with your friends and family members about how things are going. To the extent that we have biological markers of things like stress hormones, it'll correlate with that, right? Asking you is the best way we have to record how you're really feeling. But it is not something that we can do so easily with the monkeys. We just don't have great measures of how they're feeling. We can record their behavior, right? But we're still kind of guessing at how it's going for them. And so just like I wish we had a sort of thermometer to measure happiness in humans better, I would definitely wish we had one of those to measure happiness in non-human animals, because at least with people, we can ask them. With the monkeys, you can ask them, but they don't really answer you.
Kidding. Well, there was one of the experiments you did that felt like you were onto something. And so let me attempt to crudely draw the analogy here. And you can tell me where I'm off the interpretation of the experiment. But it was where if the monkey was expecting 3 pieces of food, but it got 2 pieces, it was a little bit ticked off. There was something you could tell it was frustrated. It didn't get the 3. When it was expecting 2 and got 2, then everything was sort of okay. Which feels like we'll move away from the word happiness, contentment, satisfaction. There was something there. Am I wrong? And which made me think like, a lot of this is really, and this is going to a whole rabbit hole, but it's all around happiness relative to expectations.
Yeah.
And these expectations, I think, have been so jacked up because of social media that they're so out of whack that it's almost like a lot of people are always chasing something that's just going to be forever elusive, right? Because it's not something most of us can ever touch.
Yeah, totally. So a couple of things. So those are the kinds of studies we did to ask, do monkeys care about what they get objectively, or do they kind of have in some sense, a relative expectation about what they're going to get relative to sort of what they were expecting? Maybe say they saw 3 pieces of food. So when you only get 2 and there's a 3rd one there, you're kind of a little frustrated. Or even more importantly, in some studies by myself, but also other folks like Sarah Brosnan and her colleagues, what other people get. So if a really strong way to make a monkey not want 2 pieces of food is if they see somebody else getting 3. Now they're really upset. But the particular feature of upset is hard for us to say for certain. What we know is the monkey, for example, will avoid someone who doesn't give them what they expect. But what's hard to say is what they're feeling. Are they feeling frustrated? Are they feeling angry at the experimenter? Are they feeling, a deep sense of social injustice, right? Like that they want to fix the system, right? It's really hard to know what they're experiencing. Whereas with a human, I could ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how frustrated are you? So we know they behave as though their expectation has been violated, but what they're really feeling is always hard to test.
they wouldn't act up. They wouldn't have behavioral patterns that would show that there's something that's off
Oh, for
kilter.
sure. I mean, in some of Sarah Brosdan's classic studies, the monkeys would, when they get a food reward that they otherwise would like, say, sometimes it's done with numbers, sometimes it's done with the kind of food. In her classic study, she sees the monkeys see their kind of compatriot, a different monkey, get a grape when they do the same action and they get a cucumber. And they'll do things like shake the side of their enclosure. They'll sometimes fling the cucumber away as though it's a protest. This is a food that they otherwise would love to eat. They're happy about cucumbers. It's just not as good as grapes. So they show behaviors that really look like they're frustrated. But to get at what they're really feeling, we just don't have a great measure for that. But I think what we can say from those studies is the monkeys are basing kind of their expectations, they're basing their behaviors not on what they get objectively, but what they get relatively. And I think this gives us a deep insight about one of the things that makes humans unhappy, right? Is that we could objectively be in really great circumstances, but if somebody is getting something that's slightly better than us, now all of a sudden we feel kind of crappy. One of my favorite examples of this comes in a funny way from the sports world. Researchers went out and they measured people's emotional reactions on the stand, and they on the Olympic stand. So they're looking at Olympians who win gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal. They get on the stand, and researchers just videotape and analyze their smiles. And what you find is that the gold medalists smiling pretty well, nothing too shocking there. But what's shocking is what happens when you look at what's going on with the silver medalist. They're not showing ever so much less smiling than the gold medalist. They're showing emotional expressions that are more consistent with sadness, contempt, deep anger, right? And when interviewed, it seems like silver medalists are pretty upset. Now, why? Say you win the silver medalist in the, some swimming competition, the 800 meter. Is that a swimming? I know that thing about sports.
Sure, why not?
So 800 meter. You're better at the 800 meter than pretty much everyone else on the planet. You've beat billions of people, but none of those reference points are salient to you. The one reference point that's salient to you is the person who beat you. You're thinking, oh, if I was just off by a couple seconds, if I just swam 0.2 seconds faster, I'd be the gold medalist. And you feel really crappy, right? Objectively, you're second best on the planet, but in terms of your emotions, relatively, you feel really awful. And the reason I like this study is the researchers didn't just stop at looking at the silver medalist. They also analyzed the emotional expressions of the bronze medalist. And what they find there is just the opposite. In some ways, the bronze medalists are often smiling even more than the gold medalists. They look ecstatic on the stand. And now you could be like, well, that doesn't make sense. Objectively, they're in third place, but who's their reference point? Their reference point's probably not the gold or silver medalist, because they were multiple seconds away from gold or whatever. Their reference point is oh my gosh, but for a few 2 seconds or something, I wouldn't be on this stand at all. The salient comparison to them is oh, by the skin of my teeth, I'm up here medaling, and I almost didn't do that.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I'll bet you if you take that, and I've heard that before, and it actually doesn't surprise me. I'll bet if you even just isolated the gold medal winners, and if they're, I don't know if expectation is the right word, but if their desire or their hope was to get a gold and nothing beyond that, then they're happy as can be. But if you're a Katie Ledecky or a Michael Phelps, and your goal isn't just, the gold is table stakes. It's, do you set a new world record? And if they fall short of that, then I'll bet you it's the equivalent of the silver medal winner in the typical thing. It's all back to sort of relative to what you're hoping for, what you're desiring.
Yeah. And I think even sometimes, we also have a different bias beyond just the sort of setting these relative expectations, which researchers call the arrival fallacy, which is I'll be happy when I win a gold medal. I'll be happy when I get that promotion. I'll be happy when I get into Yale University if you're one of my students. And yeah, you're happy in that moment, but that moment is fleeting, instantaneous. These days, college students tend to, they put everything on TikTok and YouTube, but one of the things they put on TikTok and YouTube is their kind of acceptance moment. So, they get some link from Yale about find out if you got in, and they click on the link, and it's either, I'm sorry, you didn't get into Yale, or it's this little video that says, yay, you got into Yale. and they record their reaction and put it on YouTube. And the ones that get the good news that they got into this Ivy League university, they're screaming and yelling, and their parents are screaming and whatever. I show these videos in class because many Yale students remember, even if they didn't film it, what their moment was like. And many students will say, that moment was great, but an hour later, I was like, oh gosh, like now I just have to do it all over again. Or like I worked that hard and that's it. Like it's not the kind of feeling you expect. And that's the arrival fallacy, right? And so I think a lot of gold medalists, in addition to maybe setting a different reference point that was so high they could never achieve it, now all of a sudden, they just, even though they've reached the thing that they wanted to reach, it's not nearly as good as they suspect. Reference points are also insidious because they shift around depending on the criteria. I was doing some work with an NBA basketball team during the pandemic when they were kind of stuck in the bubble. I was kind of doing a mini version of my happiness course for these poor basketball players that couldn't go out and do the normal things they do. And we talked a lot about reference points. And I asked them, well, who's the reference point for salary? And they all said, oh, like Steph Curry. And I was like, who's the reference point for like getting the best cars? And I don't remember, at the time it was like LeBron James or something. Right. And I was like, who is the reference point for like height? And they were like, Taco Fail. Like, and I was like, why isn't there like one like you pick the one reference point that's gonna, like, why isn't Steph Curry the reference point for height? Like then you'd all feel much better. Like, no, he's only the reference point when it comes to salaries or 3-point shooting or whatever. Right. And that's the thing about reference points is like we completely find the reference point that will make us feel most crappy about ourselves. That's the negativity bias in action, right? And that means we often are comparing ourselves, but we rarely pick a comparison point that makes us feel good or even reasonable.
You've talked openly in the past about getting burnt out. I think you were just juggling too many things. You took a year-long sabbatical, I believe. And this coming from the professor of happiness. So it obviously happens to any of us. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, well, it kind of happened, right. As I mentioned before, I was doing this job as a head of college on campus where I was living with students and working with them. And I really got so much of a sense of purpose and meaning from that role. Like it meant so much to kind of take care of these students. And, I mentioned I started this class in 2018 when it was prescient to be thinking about well-being. I didn't fast forward to March of 2020 when we had this moment where the entire community that I'd built up over several years had to get unceremoniously kicked out, uncertain whether students would ever be back, and then spent a year kind of running this residential college where students were taking classes on Zoom. There was no sporting events or a cappella. Like there wasn't even a dining hall. You just kind of showed up and grabbed a box and took it back to your room privately. And it was really tough, right? It was running this sort of strange public health experiment on campus. And I felt really responsible for the students' well-being and happiness and even their physical health during this time. And at the same time I was doing that, I was running this podcast with millions of downloads, teaching my class, running my lab and so on. And I think I was experiencing the thing that most people would experience facing these kinds of stressors, which is an overloaded work schedule, not enough rest, not a sense that what I was doing was sort of helping anybody. I was doing the job the best that I could, but it was still a really crappy situation on campus. And those are the factors that are really a recipe for burnout. And the symptoms I was experiencing were kind of classic burnout symptoms. One is the thing I think we normally think of when we think of burnout, which is a sort of sense of emotional exhaustion. And it's not just like physical exhaustion. It's not just you're tired. It's like just emotionally you can't you just can't bring yourself to get stuff done. I also experienced what a lot of people experience during burnout, which is what's called a sense of personal ineffectiveness, right? Especially during COVID, it felt like I could do my head of college job the best I could possibly do, and it would still be a kind of crappy experience for the students. There's a sense that even if you're doing the best you could, it's like not what you value, or it's kind of this mismatch with what you kind of were hoping you could do and so on. But the most insidious symptom for me was what clinical psychologists call depersonalization, which is functionally cynicism. Like everybody is getting on your last nerve. And you start to assume that people's even reasonable intentions are like, oh, this person's trying to get something out of me. You just get so frustrated. And the moment I really deeply noticed it was that, as a head of college, you often get requests from students for all kinds of things when emergencies come up. And I had a student who had to have emergency dental care and was like requesting some money from the university so he could get that covered, right? In a place where students don't necessarily have dental insurance. These are the kinds of things that come up. And my instant reaction wasn't incredible compassion for this. Oh my gosh, he had to send this email. It was so scary. And like, he's going through this pain. My instant reaction was, oh, I have to send another email, like to be frustrated.
Yeah.
And I had this moment where like some meta part of my brain noticed this and was like, that is not your normal, like, what is going on? That's your reaction to a student you care about. And so the story is that I realized that this was happening, like, oh my gosh, these are the classic signs of burnout. And I took time off. And so sometimes my story is sort of talked about as like, well, even the happiness professor like got burned out. And I was like, no, even the happiness professor with the right stressors experience the normative human reaction to this situation, which is burnout. But what did I do? I like took action to change it, right? And at the time was a really hard action, like, stepping down from this head of college position that I really adored to take a year off was really hard and took a lot of work in terms of making sure I was okay with it and making sure the community was all set and so on. But I, being an expert on this stuff, knew if I don't take action now, there's no way this doesn't get better unless I try to fix this. This is only going to get worse. And so, so sometimes it's talked about as a story of like, even you went through this. I'm like, yeah, even I, even doctors get, cancer and these things, but they know the things are things they can do quickly to sort of remedy. Even doctors get COVID, but, take care of themselves and get the vaccine when it comes, et cetera, right? So.
Is there anything that you learned about yourself, coping tools, mechanisms, so that when you came back, that you'd be in a situation where maybe you could preempt this sort of burnout from happening? Any changes in your life, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, one thing to know about burnout is that clinically, it's not exactly the same as normal kinds of stressors. Christina Maslach, who does a lot of work on burnout, talks about it as a kind of workplace individual interaction. In other words, it's not just stuff that I'm doing in terms of my coping skills that or lack of what I'm doing with my coping skills that lead to burnout. It's really an interaction with the work demands that are placed on a person and their way of coping that kind of leads to this problem. And so I did a lot of things in terms of my coping skills, right? Like I really boosted up my sense of social connection. These days I'm spending a lot more time in Boston, even though Yale's based in Connecticut, just because I have rich social connection there. That's where my mom is. And I try to spend much more time there than I had before. I think I've gotten really good at things like prioritizing exercise and self-talk strategies, all the right stuff. But Christina Maslach's work suggests you also have to take a really good hard look at the job structure you're experiencing and ask the question, is this going to be viable? Is the workload such that I can keep doing this? And the hard realization that I had was that even though I loved this head of college position, it just wasn't viable in terms of its workload with the other commitments I'd made to my podcast, to teaching, to do a lot of talks and consulting and these things. Like just something had to give. And I felt it was most responsible to the community that I cared about in my residential college to say, let somebody take the reins here because I just don't have the bandwidth to do it. So it was partly changing individual strategies and prioritizing things, getting my habits right. But it was also taking a good hard look at the job kind of individual interaction and asking the question, like, is this workload reasonable or is it always going to feel like too much? And I think I could have done, I think something had to give. It didn't necessarily have to be my head of college role. I could have, scaled back on my podcast episodes or done less talks, but I recognize that workload wise, something needed to change. And I think that's a hard thing for people facing burnout is that I recognize it's an enormous privilege to be able to walk away from certain parts of my workload that many people who are feeling like they're burning out don't have. But ultimately, if you want things to get better, something does need to give.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about this notion of being more time affluent, which I assume speaks to this, just that we tend to overschedule ourselves and just finding a way to not kill yourself, to free up some time. Just to shift gears a bit, there was some clip I heard from one of your podcasts where you touched upon a theme that I've actually come to learn from my own podcast, interviewing all these people from all different domains, which is just to stop focusing on the end goal and to think more about the journey. The journey over destination, so to speak, is ultimately what matters. We sort of loosely touched on it, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, this is a process that researchers at Stanford have referred to as sort of the journey mindset.
Hmm.
And I think it's sort of the flip side of something we talked about a little bit earlier, this idea of the arrival fallacy. We think, oh,
Yes.
when I get to this thing, I'll be good, I'll be done. But first of all, that's just like not the way happiness works. It's like, it's not like happiness, as we've mentioned, is this kind of constant daily practice of making sure you're improving your well being. It's more analogous to something like a leaky tire, where it's like, it's going to go down a little bit and you sort of fill it up, but you have to kind of keep filling it up or it'll go away. So that's kind of one misconception. But a second misconception is that kind of the journey is just the grunt work or just, something you're kind of fast forwarding through so you can get to the arrival. And I think, research really shows that there's a lot of presence, there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of flow that we can get out of the journey. And if we can kind of embrace that sense of learning, that mindset that like this is the good, the going there is the good part, that's when we can kind of learn how to do it better. And one of my favorite podcasts, as I was focused on this idea of the unhappy silver medalist, I interviewed one silver medalist who is known for being super happy, who's the Olympic skater Michelle Kwan.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things she talked about is that like, the medal stand, that was like not the awesome part. Like the awesome part was like hearing the swish on the ice and like getting up in the morning and like skating over the Olympic rings. And like, she just found so much joy in the process part, in the journey part, that she kind of didn't need to worry about the arrival, right? Because that kind of didn't matter. She was sort of getting happiness along the way. And I think that's sort of the message of the journey mindset, right? Which is like, what are you doing to focus on your growth through this? How are you noticing even the bad parts as stuff that's making you more resilient, that you can kind of get something out of? That's a sort of framework that we can use to do better, even when times are feeling tough, even when maybe those moments of arrival, those big rewards aren't there. We're not getting as many dopamine hits. If you find a way to enjoy the ride, then you'll kind of get these sort of enjoyment hits all along the way.
So I wonder, so take that example. What's Michelle Kwan doing? What were the influences around her that allowed her to appreciate being in the moment, if you will, the journey over the destination? Like, was she always that way? Did she have to make a mindset shift, or is she naturally wired? Just
Yeah.
to, right? What if someone says, "Oh gosh, I wish I could be more like that"? Did you get a sense when you interviewed her why she was that
Yeah.
way?
I think she was kind of naturally wired that way, but I think if someone wasn't naturally wired that way, they can follow a lot of the things that she did, right? So one is this real sense of presence, right? You got the sense that Michelle Kwan was like noticing stuff. Like she talked about things like, when she first gets on the ice, you can hear the swish of the skates, right? And seeing the colors and the things in the room, feeling the cold, right? She just felt like even though she'd done that a bazillion times, she was present in every moment of it, noticing the kind of tiny things. And that's something we know can make a journey better, right? Is just finding ways to be present with all the parts of it, including some of the negative parts of it, right? There's lots of evidence to show that, negative emotions don't feel great, but one thing we do like that make negative emotions even worse is we try to suppress them or avoid them or not be with them. And, research really shows that just sitting with your negative emotions, allowing them can first teach you something, but also can allow you to get through them so that they kind of take their course and pass so that you can move on and feel a little bit happier. And I really had the sense that even through the falls or through the pain or whatever, that Michelle was kind of there and present with it rather than suppressing it. And that was, I think, one of the things that contributed to her journey mindset.
Interesting. Not to get too psychoanalytical, and I don't know Michelle, but I wonder how much these people's upbringings, the influencers, the drivers that made them so hungry and goal seeking, if that maybe has, like, was it self-driven? Was it because they were pleasing their parents? How much was external versus internal? All these things. I imagine there might be some connective tissue there.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we know is that, internal rewards work so much better than external rewards. And not just that they work better, but if you add external rewards on top of internal rewards, it can sometimes what researchers call undermine them. So for example, imagine you're Michelle Kwan and you really love, you love the swish on the ice and you love the sport and it just feels good to be out there. But then you have on top of that people, praising you, saying you're good, having these like little trophies that seem to matter. all of a sudden that can make something that you once loved turn into kind of the thing that you have to do to get the reward and so on. I see this in my Yale students who, presumably are the kind of student who's at Yale because they like loved learning or really into learning early on. But now academics, even early on in high school and middle school, is so much about getting the grades and performing and studying to take the test that it like removes that enjoyment. So it's not just that the external rewards don't work as well as that internal love of learning. It's also that they end up undermining the internal love. You stop loving learning if it's all about the test. I think those of us who haven't been in a classroom in a while, but who kind of subscribe to the latest gadgets have gotten this. A lot of people who get their, Apple Watch or a Fitbit wind up, getting it because they want to move more and really enjoy exercise. But then it becomes about, I got to get my steps. And it's like, you're not right. enjoying any of it. You're like shaking your hand just to kind of get closer to that. And those extrinsic rewards can undermine the intrinsic. So I think probably I would guess that a person like Michelle, although again, not to psychoanalyze her, I chatted with her for an hour on my podcast, so I didn't get that deep with her. But my guess is that she was able to hold on to those intrinsic rewards and not kind of fall prey to the extrinsic stuff, not gonna let the extrinsic stuff sort of undermine her.
Okay. I'm going to try to get Michelle on the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask that question. Laurie, do you keep up by any chance with research on psychedelics? Because it seems like there's this increasing body of evidence around, and it's beyond my pay grade, but from what I've read, that it can actually help rewire our brains. It can reboot us, if you will, almost like this quick serotonin booster, but it could be long lasting. But curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, for sure. This is not a subject on which I'm an expert, but I've talked to smart folks on this, folks like David Yaden at the Johns Hopkins group that does lots of really great work on psychedelics. And I think a couple things there. Yes, I think some of the newer research that's coming out, and it's worth emphasizing it's newer research, in part because of the way things played out in the 50s and 60s. Researchers were not able to study these chemicals for a really long time because I think in the 60s, people played a little fast and loose with the ethics and they made really strong claims and the government was like, nope, we're shutting that down, right? So this is new, the kind of research that's coming out, in part because of what played out historically in terms of overly strong claims and so on. And so this new research is really showing that there can be a lot of benefits for many people, including some that look kind of longer lasting, right? Like one episode taking psilocybin or something like that can lead to longer range benefits. But I think there's also lots of evidence that that's not true for everybody. And for a small percentage of people who experience psilocybin and other psychedelics, they have long-term negative consequences. And so I think, what I'm kind of optimistic, but with a lot of caution about this work, because I think when people hear some of these overblown benefits, it's like, well, just try it. And it's like, actually, there are a lot of individual differences in terms of who this works for. I think we're learning a lot more about the specific context of using these kinds of drugs that really matters for their efficacy, right? Whether you're taking them in a supportive social environment versus kind of off on your own and so on. And so, so I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited, but I would be waiting for new research to come out before I jump into it. And I think folks like David Yaden are cautious, both because the research is exciting, but still mixed, especially in terms of some of the negative effects, but also because he's kind of been hurt by the history of this, where really strong claims were made and people dived in and bad things happened and the government was like, nope. And he's like, to really find out the benefits of these chemicals, we need to understand them. We need more research on them more. So he tends to, I like his work a lot because he tends to be really cautious about trying not to talk about the benefits, but not overclaiming, and also to make sure people are aware of some of the potential downsides too.
So not a panacea.
Possibly a panacea, but we don't know yet.
Maybe for some people, some circumstances. Is there a typical phase of our lifespan when we're at peak happiness? Is there such a thing?
This is actually something that's changing in recent research. So historically, people have thought of happiness as having this sort of U-shaped function where, earlier in life, you're pretty happy, teenage years, you're kind of excited, 20s. Then you get to working for us, it kind of goes down. I'm kind of moving my hand downward in the U-shaped pattern to the point where people tend to report the lowest level of happiness, which is in midlife, around between 48 and 49 years of age. You're at your lowest level of happiness, and which is actually the age that I'm at right now. So it's my nadir, unfortunately. But then historically, people would self-report becoming happier and happier. You become an empty nester. It's actually a time when parents are most happy is when their kids leave, interestingly enough. And then historically, later in life, as people got elderly, they wound up being happier. So that was kind of the general pattern of happiness. That has been changing a little bit for two reasons. One is that elderly individuals, I think especially as they get less socially connected, and honestly that there's less sort of social safety nets for them to live kind of happily, that's kind of gone down a little bit, the kind of end of life. But there's been a big shift in the beginning of life in the ways that we talked about before, which is just that young people are more depressed, more anxious, more unhappy than they've ever been, almost to the point that it's like fully flat in the U-shaped curve in a way that we've, again, never seen since these data have been being measured.
Like you might be starting out in the trough when you're or close to it. Yeah.
And that raises a really scary question that I think about with my Yale students, which is like, is that really the trough? Or do people, are these 20-year-olds and 19-year-olds who are really depressed and anxious, what's it going to look like when they're in midlife and in between taking care of their kids and their elderly parents? Like, is the normal going down of happiness going to continue for these folks, but they're starting at a lower baseline? And that's something we don't know because these patterns are sort of new now.
Yeah. I know this will never fly, but if you could run an experiment where you have half the incoming freshmen do everything they normally would with their phones, with social media, and the other half, no Facebook, no Insta, no TikTok, no anything social media, and see if there's a delta between those two groups. I would venture to guess that there would be a huge one.
Yeah, although I think the way you'd need to do it, honestly, is I mean, you mentioned, half, say, the Yale class gets phones, the other half doesn't. I would actually like to get a matched school, maybe Harvard, Stanford, and have one. So the problem, and this kind of comes up in a lot of the conversations about taking phones out of high schools, is that it's really hard to be the one kid who doesn't have a phone in a community where everybody's using these things, because the benefits that you're not getting access to are really salient.
Yeah, that's true.
But if your whole community got rid of phones, right? If all of Yale banned phones and no one had cell phones, then I think in some ways that would be easier to start seeing some of the benefits. And that's harder in a university setting because these folks are 18 years of age. It's just harder to do these things. I think those are some of the solutions for younger students, like in middle schools and high schools, is to think about not phone bans, but at least kind of phone restrictions that are really community-wide. Where I've seen kind of the research showing the most benefits is when you can institute those sort of bans, not within a family, but within kind of an entire community. So the whole school or the whole sports team or the whole church community, whatever it is, gets rid of them at the same time.
Okay, you have my permission to try it with the entire incoming class. Let me know how that
I'll let you know how it goes. I'll let you know.
All right, Laura, we will wrap with this, which is how I wrap every interview, which is the podcast is called The Art of Excellence. And I felt the word success was too defining, and excellence, I wanted really my guest to define what it means to them. So what's the word mean to you?
I think excellence to me means kind of behaving and developing mindsets in a way that allows you to flourish and experience a life that you're satisfied with.
Wow. That's fantastic. Did you practice that? That's perfect.
No. I didn't know it was coming, but yeah.
It just flowed right out. I love it. I love it. Well, I could have literally spent an hour just asking about the monkey experiments. There's so much I know about the background before all of this happiness stuff came to be, but this has been such a treat for me. And I hope I didn't lower the happiness curve today. At least I kept it constant, but you elevated mine and you got my mind off of things happening tomorrow and the rest of the week. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed it, Laurie.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, here's my ask of you. First, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Second, tell a friend. Better yet, share it with all your friends and contacts on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Honestly, wherever you hang out online is fine with me. Please leave me a review if you could on iTunes or Spotify or both. The reviews really do help. And finally, try to find one takeaway from this episode that you can apply to your own life. Commit to trying something, anything, as the saying goes, no harm in trying. I leave you with this one question. How do you define the word excellence?